Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we focus on the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the ego of all of the other people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And I'm DM Mitch.
So today we're talking about one of our favorite topics that I feel like gets into every episode at least a little bit, and that is homebrewing.
Especially DM-nastics, let's be honest.
True. And so we're taking a deeper dive into homebrewing, and today we're going to have TC Sottek, the managing editor of The Verge, with us today, and I think it is a great episode full of information for you to listen to. But before that, we're going to do some iTunes reviews.
All of these following reviews come from the great country of Canada, and the first one comes from Pass It Along and is entitled For Game Masters of Every Level. Great guests, good conversation, awesome ideas. This show is a must listen for anyone currently running a campaign or looking to run one in the future. Thank you so much for that awesome review. Pass it along.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and hopefully you pass it along to your friends and tell them to listen to the podcast. And I'm blown away that you did not steal the joy that I will now have in saying this title or this person's name. And the next review comes from Darth Magikarp. And it's a 5-star review in my opinion just because of that. But they entitled it...
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be some fan art of Darth Magikarp. That would be amazing.
Oh, it's taking everything in me not to start looking for that right now.
I can almost imagine it being super dangerous because you have a Magikarp using Splash with a lightsaber in his hand, and he's doing so much damage with the lightsaber, but it's like all random wherever he splashes.
Someone has a tattoo of it. It's literally the first image I found on the internet.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Maybe it is the person who wrote in Darth Magikarp. If it's not Darth Magikarp, get that tattoo.
I can only hope. And they wrote the review entitled Just Good. Found the cast a while ago, binging it, lots of good inspiration and advice. Cheers, guys. Done. Perfect.
Cheers right back to you, Darth Magikarp. And our last one is from Biltish, and it's titled, I'm talking about ... I was talking about looking for a podcast to help me as a new DM. Then we were talking about finding this one. I don't understand what this is saying. So we are going to talk about how I am in deep now. Now let's talk about how I have a lot of content to go through, and then I'll talk about how I am loving it in a later review. We talked about how I do, though. Thanks, and keep it up. All right, that was a review. Thanks, Biltish. Super appreciated.
Oh, what is happening? Why do these exist? Mitch, I'm going to change your life.
What are you looking at?
Darth Magikarp. What do you think I'm looking at? Now that's the blooper. What are you looking at? Darth Magikarp. And with all that out of the way, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
Welcome to another segment of The Meat. Today, we are joined by TC Sottek, managing editor of The Verge and the creator of the upcoming Quest RPG. TC, welcome to the Dungeon Master's Block.
Hey, Mitch. Hey, Neal. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, of course.
We have a very open-ended question to start our interview process, and that is, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. As you said, I'm an editor at The Verge, which is a online magazine covering the intersection of science and technology. I've been doing that for about 7 years now, since before we launched, and it's been a total blast. I'm a gamer. I've been playing games since my dad brought home an IBM-compatible computer in the 90s. Started climbing Treasure Mountain, playing Heroes Quest.
Nice.
And ever since then, I've been totally hooked on fantasy stuff. This is the Dungeon Master's Block, and I must admit, actually, I only started playing tabletop role-playing games about 4.5 years ago.
Oh, you're good.
And it happened because of my job, Wizards of the Coast. One of the perks, they sent us an early preview of 5th edition before it came out. My colleague and friend Dieter Bone dropped it on my desk and said, "Hey, I think you'd be interested in this." as soon as I picked it up, I was up until 2 a.m. reading the whole thing and then reading all about Dungeons and Dragons. And it was just incredible. It's like everything that I loved about EverQuest and other fantasy games, but something that was completely open-ended, more personal, more intimate.
More options.
Yeah, more options.
Any options, yeah.
Yeah, the possibilities are limitless, really, truly limitless. There's like a moment in Dungeons and Dragons or any game like this, right, where something clicks in your head and you realize that anything is possible, and that's the moment that I think you get hooked forever on these kind of games. Anyway, fast forward a few years later, I working on the game called Quest. We're calling it the role-playing game for everyone, which sounds like a big sell, but it's really an ideal that we're striving toward when we're designing this thing, me and my editor. This is a project where I really wanted to distill what I know about tabletop RPGs and games in general into something that focuses on the parts that really surprise and delight while getting rid of a lot of the crunchy parts of traditional games that kind of don't really advance the story, in my opinion. So Quest is, what I'm working on right now. It's going to be launching on Kickstarter on June 5th. And I'll just say, this thing is written very conversationally. My rule for writing this book was, is this how I'd want to explain the thing to someone I just met in a bar? The goal was to make something that people could pick up who have never done anything like this before, and in about 15 minutes of reading, understand the basics of tabletop role-playing and what it's all about. That's what I'm working on.
Fantastic. You created and are creating a whole homebrew system, which is what we're here to talk about today. And you can really hear the thought process behind all of that and the work that's gone into all of that. So, Neal, you have a surprise question, I believe, for TC.
I do. And I feel like this is applicable to the topic. So this is from Gallican, one of our Silver Dragon Patreon members. And they asked, is there a particular book, movie, or TV show that kickstarted a creative moment for you? If so, which one?
Hi, Gallican. I will be honest with you. I sleep next to a stack of adventure books from Wizards of the Coast. Before bed, I'll look at the Game Master's Manual. I'll look at the Player's Handbook. What am I reading? The Monster Manual. Yeah. I will say my favorite book that I read recently was the Curse of Strahd adventure. It's almost its own its own contained universe and game, right? Like D&D powers it, but you could have given me that book and I would have said, this is an amazing game, not knowing anything about D&D. This is an amazing story, amazing world.
Yeah.
And they say that in the introduction of the book. They say, I don't remember who created it, but they said, my first experience playing D&D was doing this dungeon run, and in one random room there was this vampire. And it made no sense for this vampire to be in this room. Like, I wanted to know what his backstory was. I wanted to know what his motivations were. I wanted to know why he was here and not in some castle in some faraway land rich with meaning. And I think that really opened my eyes to what the purpose of this kind of game is. And it's just to tell a story, right? Like, that's all the rules of a game like D&D or Dungeon World or Apocalypse World games. Any game like this, that all the rules are supposed to do is help you tell a story. So that was pretty illuminating for me and inspiring.
Thanks, Gallican, for that question, and thank you, TC, for that answer. So let's start talking about what we came here to talk about today, home-brewing content. And let's start off at the beginning with some discussion on, when and how do you begin homebrewing content? Now, this can be, TC, you're working on a whole system, but for the listeners out there, for the GMs, for the DMs out there, you might just want to start with some weapons, you might want to start with some items, right, some monsters, some races, some classes. How do you start and when do you start? I know all three of us here have worked on homebrew content before. Neal, you're very heavy into it with the forums. You're constantly throwing out exercises. TC, you're making a whole system. I love to do it in my spare time. When is the time to start homebrewing content?
That's a good question.
But TC, you already have the answer. It's exactly why you started making Quest RPG. So
that's true. But let me zoom out for a second, because I think that's a philosophical question as well.
Yeah.
I think, one thing I noticed, first of all, Dungeons & Dragons is my favorite game of all time.
You're in good company.
I haven't been playing it as long as other people, but it really unlocked something that I thought was special and meaningful. And the first thing I noticed when I started playing it is that I wanted to break everything. Some rules just seemed annoying. Some parts of it were awesome. There was just a flood of information all at once about this entire universe of possibility. So of course, as the first thing I decided to do as a first time dungeon master was recruit 2 groups of players and create an entirely original world and story for 10 people, which was insane. Nobody should do that. Don't be like me. Start small with a small group of people and don't build your own entire world. But anyway, I was up late every night world building. As soon as I got this book, I went down some super deep holes. One night I spent 5 hours on Etsy looking at wax sealing stamps because I decided I wanted to surprise my players with physical props. The way I invited them to the game was by leaving them handwritten wax sealed letters on their desks at work. I mean, I don't think anybody needs to be as crazy as I am, but I think realistically everyone who decides to become a game master or a dungeon master begins homebrewing in the first session. And that's because the job of the DM is to be a storyteller. But what that really means is that they're a game designer, because the game is just a way to tell a story, and the story is how you play the game. And because there's so much responsibility and possibility there, I think the vast majority of GMs and DMs immediately make the game their own somehow, whether it's coming up with a house rule because nobody knows how something works, or because you decide you don't like one of the game's rules, or you just want to do something different. I've spoken to a lot of tabletop players in the past few years, and I can't remember one person who said they play or run a game 100% according to the rules as written. So I think the question is not, yes, when it's not when to get started homebrewing, because I have a hunch that 99% of people are doing it as soon as they start the game. Something like the D&D Player's Guide is like a Bible, and of course there are endless interpretations of that, and people pick and choose what they want, and that's awesome.
That's funny. I haven't thought about it in that sense before with, as you said, like when a DM is like making a call to like, oh, I don't know this rule, let's do this. They might be doing that in the sense of I just don't know it, and they're just trying to make a call to get the game moving, but they are in that moment, they are homebrewing a rule for their game, and who knows, maybe they're going to analyze it after the game and go, the official rule is better, but maybe they land and say, no, I like this rule. If you ever played D&D 3.5, what DM didn't homebrew grapple rules because grapple rules were awful in 3.5? It was like 5 pages. Neal, I'm really interested to hear when you kind of started homebrewing, because you're the one who's been playing RPGs the longest here. You're like, it's since you were in diapers, right?
Yes. That's more awkward because of how long I wore diapers, not when I started playing D&D. No. Yes. You kind of broke my brain with the homebrew as well, because anecdotally, I started with people that were playing second edition, so that the way that critical damage was calculated, you didn't add the bonus again. So I went essentially for 20 years with that being the case, and someone else came to the table and was like, well, no, in Pathfinder, that's what you do. And I was essentially like ready to flip a table, like, that's not what you do.
You are
and
wrong.
So we go to the books, and I'm like, this is definitely what you do.
That's enough to start a religious war.
Yeah, he died. No, his character died. Did it? I think it did. That's beside the point. But I think for me, and I think it follows pretty closely to what TC said, no matter how closely I would want to keep to the material, the second I started interacting with the players, things started to change. Because the ideas that they come to the table with of, oh, well, I want my character to be this. I want the game to look like this. No matter what you have ready to go, you need to start adapting it, because you want to make what the players want to play in just as much as they want to play in the world that you've created. So for me, that's where it started, was looking at actually like different races or how to tweak a class so that the person could get their idea out. So it was actually, for me, homebrewing starting with what the players wanted.
I would kind of agree with both of what you guys are saying, and just point out too that if you keep on holding back and trying not to start because you're afraid of messing up and not creating a monster in the right way or creating an item and not doing it like TC was kind of saying, like buy like the official handbook and like holding to like, oh, that's the Bible of D&D. If I mess up anything, like I can't mess up anything. You need to start somewhere. You may create your first monster, and let's be honest, it may be terrible as far as it concerns like the official rules, But the most important thing is that it works in your game. And maybe it won't even do that, but you have to start trying somewhere. And the more that you do that, the better you're going to get.
Yeah.
I think maybe this is the point where we can kind of shift gears and start talking about, like, if we have any tips for beginners who are starting to do this, like, what are ways to make this process easier? And I would say, like, I think my mind always goes to monsters because that's the thing that I homebrew the most and I find the most fun to create. But I would just say you need to start small. Like, what's the most important things when it comes to a monster? It's the AC, it's the hit points, and how much damage do they do. You can create a homebrew monster, like, in a couple seconds just by, like, writing down those couple of things if you need, like, a boss fight for your PCs. They took a different way down the dungeon. They figured out something. They opened this door that you were not expecting them to go to. You hadn't had it planned. You need something right then and there. Start homebrew creating, and then you can kind of flesh that out as you go.
I would actually argue those things that you just mentioned are the last step in creating a creature. Like, those are the last things you should think about. I think the first thing you should think about when you're making anything for your rule or for your world is, why is it here? Every item, every creature, every person, every cup, plate, fork in your world should have a reason to be where they are. And I think when you start there, when you think about how something came to be in the world, what its place is, how it affects the environment around them, considering how people in your world, how the players might think about the thing that you're putting in there, I think once you think about those things, the crunchy stuff follows from that, and it's easy to do, right? If you're creating a hill giant and you give it a little bit of a backstory, a reason to exist, some motivations, you think about what it cares about and why it is where it is. Yes, the AC, the hit points, and everything are important, but I think when you start from where from the believability and the purpose area, you automatically set up that thing to have more meaning and interaction in your world other than combat. I think for the AC, for the challenge rating type stuff, the best resource you have is official materials, right? Like, when I built my own world for D&D, my original story, I shamelessly ripped from Ruins of Phandelver, from Rise of Tiamat, like Princes of the Apocalypse. Like, I just went through all their books and I looked at the encounters that they created and I just ripped the stuff out of there. I took creature stat blocks, I renamed them. I took entire encounters and kind of used them just as formats. I think that kind of mechanical stuff, there's so much out there that Wizards and other players have already provided you with that it's pretty easy to just kind of take it and adapt it to your own. But again, like I said, I think the big question is you need to come up with a reason why something is in your world. The difficulty in coming up with appropriate challenge rating for your players is real. I think it is difficult. I will say, I just want to mention 2 rules that I have, in the Game Master's Guide and Quest. I have rules, official rules that don't actually sound like rules. But I think they apply to D&D equally to any other tabletop role-playing game. I call these the prime directives for the GM. One of them is be fair to yourself, because it's a hard job, right? Like, sometimes people aren't having fun. If the group doesn't seem to be working, you might assume it's your fault. And that includes things like making things that are too challenging for the group or putting them in situations that seem like they can't win. And you have to relax and realize it's fun, it's a game, it's a story you're telling together. You are not obligated to hurt your players or to ruin them. So the second part of that is called the mercy rule, which is if you are going to kill your players because you made something that's too powerful or too dangerous or too bad, you don't have to, right? Like, that's not your player's fault. It's your fault, but it's also, it's not a big deal. The advantage that you have as the DM or the GM or whatever is that you control everything. You have all this private information that your players don't have, so you can change stuff on the fly. If your creature is too difficult, have it knock the party out but run away or steal their stuff, right? Like, usually the case is that most creatures in the world aren't completely bloodthirsty things, right? Like they don't. You don't have to assume that everything in the world wants to kill you or wants to completely end you as their objective in a fight or in a conflict. So there's lots of ways, like you want to be thinking about, especially when you create in part of character creation. This is why I said, thinking about the creature's place in the world and its motivations and its goals is so important. Is like once you think about that stuff, you also naturally think of some ways to give your party outs.
Kill them. No, I'm just kidding.
Neal, you were talking about in terms of responding to what your players want to do with homebrew, and I think that is like one of the number one sources of inspiration for making things in the world. I think, getting down into specifics about how you actually make these things, I think the difficult thing to do is to create parts of the game and the story that are both fun and durable. And let me explain what I mean by durable. I think the best homebrew stuff, or stuff that you can create in general for a type of game like this, gives people the potential to use it in lots of different ways that aren't obvious at face value. And when I'm designing something, I call this the one-note joke rule. You rarely want to create something that can only be used in one way, and you especially don't want to create something that is very tempting to use all the time in that one specific way. Like, for example, you could create a spell that's only effect is it makes people pee their pants. But you better be prepared to have a story where that's the only thing that's happening if you give that to a player.
True.
If you think something like that is funny, like if you think of something like that you want to be possible, I think the best advice I can give is to zoom out and think about how to give someone the possibility of doing it without telling them that they can or telling them how they can. And I think, D&D's prestidigitation spell is a great example of that. You can combine various effects that don't explicitly tell you what to do. They just kind of unlock your imagination. So when you're creating big things, general things like spells or abilities, you want to make sure you're trying to create something that has flavor and potential, but that doesn't risk being a one-note joke.
I want to return to TC. You were saying that a good place to start is like figure out why the monster is there or the item is there, something along those lines. And I would say that another tip I would have is taking something, and I think we've all been saying this is something we've done, is looking at something that's already created, whether it's an official thing or gaining inspiration from other people's homebrews. The thing is, we're not encouraging stealing of those properties at all. What I would say is, especially for the official stuff, you can take something like an orc or a beast or something along those lines, and you can create a modded version of it. And I think that question that you're saying, TC, of like, why is that thing here? Like, take this ogre and say, okay, what is the deal with this ogre? What is he doing in this area? And what changes with this creature that makes its stats change, that makes its backstory change? And you can take a regular ogre and you can take it and say, well, this ogre is a forger. And so let's give him some nice, awesome armor. Let's say that he's even dabbling with alchemy. Let's give him this awesome fire gun. What are the stats that then need to change for that? I know, Neal, this is like this whole idea of where does your creative process start? This is going to be different for everybody. You, with the DMnastics exercises, you've gone through so many like different ways to gain inspiration and start this. I know a lot of the times, Neal, your DMnastic exercises start with just, here's an image. Let's create the backstory. Let's create the stats. Can you talk a little bit to that aspect of it, like the creative process and where do you start?
Yeah, especially from an inspiration perspective, that's the eeasiest part. By the way, there's inspiration everywhere.
When you get into the crunch, that's
honestly,
it gets harder. Yeah,
yeah. Honestly, Pinterest. I swore off it forever because I was like, I don't need to know about no cupcakes. But then I found out it's truly amazing, and I think seeing something and almost feeling it, and I think this is the thing, is like the homebrew start is almost a feeling of like, I can't not put this in my game for X reason. Like, I see this monster, it needs to exist. And like you said, it could be a reskin of like, it's this big hulking creature that kind of looks like an ogre but has these really long arms. Well, I'm just going to take an ogre and give it a 10-foot reach. And I think that's the other great tool for homebrewing, is to start with, why is it different? TC, you mentioned hill giants. Well, what if I said, like, I really like giants because they're cool. I've got a party of all dwarves. They all do well against them, but my entire campaign is set in the desert. Well, then we have desert giants. And their special move is that and this is what I immediately thought of, is that they throw sand, which is terrifying to me.
Instead of
because
boulder
now your
throw?
players
Oh.
are blind. Yeah, are like blinded, and maybe it's obscured, but they're used to it, so that your players have disadvantage and the giants don't. But I think the other key thing about homebrewing, and I love that and essentially we all know we're our worst critics, but to try and keep in our mind not to be. But for homebrewing, it's different. I think a lot of people will approach homebrewing and think, okay, it needs to be at this expert level, completely balanced, blah, 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 but you're not selling it. You're not putting it out there to be marketed if it's specifically for homebrewing. So you can fine tune whatever you homebrew to exactly what it needs to be for your world, your players. So if it's ramped up to 11, but that's because you gave all your players way too many magic items, as Neal raises his hand, then that's fine. Like, it's totally fine that it's ramped up that far because that's the world and the game you're playing. But so the other quick shout out for tools is to go to D&D Beyond, search for James Intricasso, friend of the show, and he has a whole series on how to build items, specifically to be put on the guild and through D&D Beyond. But it's a good exercise of a step-by-step process for most things in 5th edition. Or you could go to thestruggleisneal.com and which I've been doing homebrew items there based off of album covers, and I've been very intentional about picking apart the different pieces of Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that's another good tip as someone who wants to homebrew is, let's say you start with a sub race. So most recently I made 2 sub races of Goblin. After that, start doing, even before you may need it, start branching out and doing the other pieces, because it'll make you better at all of it. And it can also prepare you to say you want a monster, and now you kind of have some practice and you've already made a few, or you want a weapon or a magic item and you've already made a few. So definitely I would say keep making stuff.
The last tip that I would give for beginners is to, when you're creating homebrew content, because we're all kind of saying, hey, just get started at it. You got to start somewhere. You may stumble a little bit, but just get started. Everything that you create, make sure that you're saving an editable document of that homebrew creature, because just because it doesn't hold up to something that you make maybe a year later or 2 years later or whatever, that doesn't mean that the content isn't good and you can go back and you can edit it to when your levels rise of oh, I'm getting better at this, I'm getting better at this. Save it as an editable document so that you can go back and you can make changes easy. So before we move on, we're going to start talking about playtesting, but is there any other tools for homebrewing that we could throw out there for people who want to start doing this or who are already doing this and maybe don't know about these tools?
3 things. 1, just Google, right? Type in homebrew D&D. You're going to come across forums, subreddits, websites, lots of different, there's endless content on the internet where people are sharing homebrew items that they've made, giving backstories for their items, telling you how it worked at their tables. There's a ton of stuff. You'll whether it's maps, items, spells, traps, any creatures, anything you can think of, people have made it already. And you should just go be inspired by them and learn from them. But I'll say the best resource that you have available, the best tool, is either a pen and paper or a Google Doc where you're writing down the private information that you have about your players, your game, and your world. You should be taking detailed notes after every session about what happened, and you should train yourself to observe your players when you're running a game to see where they're actually enjoying themselves the most and which parts of the story they get most excited about and are most invested in, because that is really the raw material that is going to be most effective for you when you're homebrewing things. The number one thing you want to do when you create anything for your game is to make it meaningful to your players. And then the last thing, just a concrete tip when you're creating anything, I call this my 3 things rule. Think of 3 things to describe it, whether it is eye color, the way someone's hair whips around their face when they walk towards you, their stride. Think of 3 specific things that you can describe about an item, a creature, or a place, and that gives people enough to imagine it and fill in the gaps for themselves. I've played with people who are brand new to this type of game, and they lose their minds when they realize that I'm saying something to them and they imagine it. They're like, how does that work? Like, that you've had it all along. It's your imagination. But yeah, think of 3 things to describe anything that you're creating, and it'll be successful at the table.
I think I would obviously say, if you're working on Dungeons and Dragons, like, the official books give really good guidelines to, here's what you need to do, here's some, like, what, yeah. And you're not, as we've said, you're not held to that. But that's a good place if you really would like to get an idea. That's a good place to look at. I would also say check out other systems, because you're going to get great ideas from those other systems. If you're making your own system, you don't want to just be looking at Dungeons and Dragons. You want to look at other systems. If you're looking at other systems, and you're just playing Dungeons and Dragons, you might see a great rule that you're like, I want to bring that over to my D&D game. I want to bring the Jenga tower from Dread over and use it in the D&D game. I want to bring Sanity over from Cthulhu. I want to bring the light side, dark side points over from the Star Wars games. There's great rules that you can bring over to homebrew a rule. The other thing I would say is, I may have started the forums, and this is just going to be a shout out, but I may have started the forums, but Neal is right now the king of our DMB forums, and the DMnastics over there really, like, Neal, you run a fantastic, like, show of, like, my goodness, I think everybody who joins in on those exercises gets better together, and it's just a friendly community that helps each other out making homebrew content. So I have to say, if you want to start with homebrew content, Neal and the rest of the crew that are working on DMnastics, they can do a lot to help you out.
Agreed. I mean, and that is more people giving their ideas than me doing that much. That said, my favorite part of that, though, is people that have not really listened to a lot of our podcast, but are still just like, oh, these are great, and then just keep doing them. And you can follow us on Twitter, where we post a daily DMnastic where you can check other people's ideas there. I think the quick tip I would give for a tool for homebrewing is, unless you're working with a fairly small indie game, look to what third-party people are doing. You know, so look to Kobold Press, who are super successful with their Pathfinder in 5e material. So, I mean, they're homebrewing for money. I mean, I guess, that is trivializing the amazing work that they do, but that is the essence of it, is that they're homebrewing for money, and that's awesome. And you can, like, the Tome of Beasts, like, making a zombie different because it's from the swamp and has, quote, vomit leeches. So there you go. That's the kind of the idea, is to look at other people that are doing it. There's, a ton of different Powered by the Apocalypse games. I'll guarantee you there's a ton of third-party stuff for everything Star Wars. So find what other people are doing, and I guess that's it. Just be a pirate. Just steal what you need.
All right, so let's start talking about playtesting, because if you're homebrewing, playtesting is a big part about this. What are some thoughts on playtesting? TC, I'm assuming playtesting is something you're probably in the stages of doing.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, what are your thoughts on playtesting? And, like, what are some tips to playtesting and some advice to those who are going to be getting into playtesting their homebrew material?
Yeah, so playtesting, from where I sit right now, is a very rigorous process, right? I'm playtesting a game that hopefully will go out to many people. We have over 500 testers right now who are they're in our Discord. They're giving me feedback over email. I've called some people on the phone to talk to them. There's a Google form where they're giving us feedback. I've basically said, throw all of your ideas at me as much as possible so I can just absorb your feedback. So at this scale, it's very much like a rigorous process, because we're creating a product that has to go out to a lot of people. So I have to, there are specific criteria I'm looking for, types of feedback that I weigh against each other. Things like balance and logic. Are rules in conflict with each other? Things like that. But for most people, I think you're going to be doing kind of what I alluded to before, which is, look at the faces of the people at the table. Right? Like, how are they reacting to the things that you're putting into the world? How are they reacting to each other? You can't always anticipate how something is going to be used, so you have to observe carefully how it's being used. And you have to be willing to change things if they're not working, right? Like, let's say you give someone a completely overpowered item that makes them that makes other players in the group feel less important or less able to do things. You can change that, right? Like, let's say you give them an item that just does this insane amount of damage. Well, the players don't know everything that you know about the things in the world, right? So over time, you can have that weapon's ability diminish, or you can unlock an additional secret about it at some pivotal moment that creates a trade-off, right? Like maybe it becomes a sentient item, or something that has a drawback that you unlock at a certain moment. There are ways that you can give yourself, as the DM, outs, right, with things that you put in the world, so that you're not obligated, committed to have a mistake persist forever. Yeah, I mean, it could also be as simple as like, man, you rolled a critical fail, and that sword just fell down a grate. Oh no, like, it's tough. It's mean and it's tough, but there are ways that you can kind of take things back.
But I would say that that's also less mean if, when you're going into a playtesting setting, that you are just straight up with the players at the beginning and say, hey guys, this is homebrew. Part of why we're doing this is for me to test out how powerful things are, what doesn't work, what does work, and get the players on the page where they know, okay, we might be changing some things as we go along. Or something like you were just saying, TC, like if we together, and it'd be great if you could play with a group of players who are all for that play testing, and together can be like, yeah, this item is quite crazy. Like, so that you can have that crit one moment and everybody just goes, makes sense, that sword was ridiculous.
Tough but fair.
Yeah, being straight with the players, I think, right away. Yeah, especially if you're going to not just play a one-shot, but play like a campaign to play test something with. Just being straight up with them, I think, is a very important thing to start out with.
Absolutely. Honesty and openness is key. I mean, the DM in any system, I don't care what you're playing, the DM and the players are equals. They have different responsibilities, but they're partners in telling a story.
Yes.
And so the players need to feel like you are just as invested in their enjoyment and fun as they are in making the game something special. So I think if you go to it with that atmosphere or with that attitude, rather than like, okay, I'm going to run a video game for you and I'm just going to be the physics engine, and that's not the kind of relationship that you want to have with players. You want to have something that's honest and open, where mistakes can be forgiven and there's a little bit of flexibility and hopefully no hurt feelings if something goes wrong. But yeah, I mean, D&D is just one big play test. There's no there's infinite possibility. No game is alike. You're testing something, you're improvising something every time you play. Try to put yourself in your player's shoes. Think about how they play, the kinds of things that they tend to do. If you have a player who's obsessed with min-maxing and all they want to do is like squeeze the highest percentile out of every situation, you should be putting yourself in their shoes and imagining how they're going to use something or how they're going to respond to something that you put in the world. And that should influence how you design that item, or in how you...
I mean, all of it's kind of interesting because with homebrew, sometimes you don't get playtesting. And I think that's why, not being completely set on everything that you have written down, like, okay, they killed this way too easy. He or she, the monster now has 100 extra hit points. Leave me alone. The other place that is good or could be good now, this is a slow process, but it would be play by post. Also, the 5th edition Facebook group is at like 123,000 now. I mean, if you want to find people to play or play test, and being like it was already mentioned, open and honest, that's the purpose, I think you could probably pretty easily find people that would be willing to play test a scenario for you, which is actually what I did for something I wrote. I got some people together for a play by post and tested a monster I had and adapted and changed things based on its interaction with those players.
Another good thing to do, especially if you're playing a long-term campaign and you want to have a session where you're explicitly testing things, is to do a prequel or a side story. Basically just interrupt the campaign with a one-shot and say, hey, I actually did that. The D&D campaign that I had been running with my friends that I created a world for, an entire world for D&D and characters, and we'd been playing for maybe 2 years. And then I created Quest, and we decided to switch. And before we just did that, we had a prequel where their characters and we played before our story began with the new system to just see if it worked. And they really liked it, so we switched. But if you want to truly test something that's radically different or that's different enough where it could cause problems in your story, just put the story on pause. Like don't give yourself, don't make the stakes too high. Take a break from your campaign, do something small and limited so that people are not feeling like, the world's going to end if something goes wrong.
Yeah. And you kind of mentioned this before, TC, but I mean, you mentioned also the players, and hopefully there aren't hurt feelings on the player side when you need to nerf something or get rid of something. But there's the other aspect that needs to be discussed, and it's been discussed a little bit, but like as the creator of this homebrew content, you need to have two things. One, you need to be able to take criticism. And honestly, if you're playtesting, you should be looking for constructive criticism so that you can work on. You might need to do a whole big change to something to make it work, but that's what playtesting is all about. I think you also want to make sure that you have not just like one person looking at it, but the more person you're looking at or playing your homebrew material, the better of an idea you're going to get, because maybe that one person who says this doesn't work, maybe there's 6 other people who says it does work, or vice versa. One person says it works great because he's got that sword that kills with one hit. And then the rest of the people give you the feedback of that's just not fair. I think you need a good size group. If you're able to put out your homebrew material for other people to play, that's a fantastic thing to do. In fact, if you're able to give that homebrew material to other DMs and GMs to run with, I think that's a great way to get feedback on your material as well. You need to be ready, though, for criticism, but I think the other thing is that you want to find people that are going to give you constructive criticism and also tell you when something works great and like, man, this is fantastic. Keep that. Don't change that. That's great from all sides. Those, I think, are two really important aspects that you want to have there for playtesting.
At the end of every game that I play, and I'm actually considering building this as an official rule in Quest, I ask the players to name something that they really liked about that session and name something that they didn't like. And the reward is that they actually get experience for participating in that conversation. So you definitely want to like give your players opportunities to give you those moments of like structured moments of feedback rather than having them worry about whether it's appropriate or not. Go to them and say, hey, I'm open to taking criticism. I'm open to thinking about this as a shared experience, and that, letting them know, accepting criticism is letting them know that you're equals in telling the story.
I'm going to give you feedback right now and say, make that an official rule. I love that idea. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, with all of that out of the way, we have one last question. The most important question. Where can people go to find you on the internet and all the cool things you're doing, TC?
Cool. I am on Twitter at chillmage, ChillMage.
Nice.
You can find me there. Quest is currently on Kickstarter. It wraps up at the end of June, so please check it out. We're also on the web at www.adventure.game. Don't ask me how I got that domain. I don't know. Luck. But yeah, it's like I said, we're hoping it's the role-playing game for everyone. We especially want people who have never played a game like this to be able to get into it. We want people who are veterans to have something deep enough that they can enjoy as well. And hopefully it's the game that they can finally get their reticent family and friends who have been resisting this kind of thing for years to get into. But yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate the conversation. This was a lot of fun. And good luck keeping your players alive.
Well, we hope that you have enjoyed that episode. We want to thank TC again for joining us and talking about homebrewing content and giving just some advice and some tips for those of you who may be looking to start this or dive in deeper. Neal, if any of our listeners would like to send us an email, send us maybe some tips that they have for homebrewing content, or maybe send us some homebrew content that they have created to look over, where can they reach us at?
They can always email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com and give us all of those ideas. And if you see fit and have enjoyed the show, definitely head on over to iTunes where you can leave us a 5-star review that we'll read out on air.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMS_block. Or you can like our Facebook page, or you could do both of those things. They're both great places for updates about the show, memes, and just all-around D&D goodness. We have a Patreon member shout-out of the week, and this week's Patreon member shout-out goes to
William Johnstone!
Thank you so much, William. William Johnstone, first of all, has a fantastic name. Second of all, William is a silver dragon.
Awesome.
And we hope that you are enjoying all of the rewards that you get for being a silver dragon with our Patreon. Thanks so much for your support.
Yes, thank you. As always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out our other shows like Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, Detentions and Dragons, Geek Wars, and more.
Well, that's all that we have for you today on this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come together to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
Killing characters,
and lowering the egos of all their people at the table.
I'm DM Neal. Good night, good luck.
And keep on dungeon mastering.
Time to get a Darth Magikarp tattoo.
Goodbye.